up on the health info. Today our guest speaker is Dr. Brian Schroeder. The subject tonight is everything you want to know about the gut-brain. Find out everything going with your gut instinct is always the best way to make the right decision. That's all yours, Brian. Thanks.
That's right. Good. Can we kill the lights just at the front here so they can see the screen better? That's perfect. Okay. So, our topic for tonight is the gut brain, the second brain living in your intestines. Didn't know that, did you? You have another brain down here. What's it doing? Okay. So we're going to talk about how this brain influences your mood and well-being, and it goes even beyond that into what are considered so-called mental illnesses, and we're going to talk about how those come about. It used to be, I mean, they've known for an awful long time that there's lots of nerve tissue in the intestine, but the prevailing thought process was that it's just there to manage the digestion of food and moving stuff through and controlling bowel movements and all that kind of stuff. But now the latest research is showing that it's involved in way, way, way more than that. So, you know, everybody knows, you know, and for a long time people have been aware that stress and different types of emotional situations can cause you to have strange feelings in your intestine. You know, the old butterflies in the stomach routine, and you know, people sometimes get, you know, choked up if they're really emotional and they can hardly swallow or breathe and that. So we know that those nerve endings are connected to muscles and they're connected to how the intestines work. So what it really comes down to is that, you know, there's a whole network of neurons lining the intestines that they've now figured out is so extensive that scientists sometimes refer to it as a second brain, or they'll sometimes call it, you know, the enteric nervous system. Enteric meaning having to do with intestines, right? So this is just out of Wikipedia. It's a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system that directly controls the gastrointestinal system of vertebrates, and it's derived from the neural crest. Now what they're talking about here is derived from the neural crest. Oops. Just back that up. When they're talking about neural crest, they're just talking about in embryology, you know, when things are forming and being created in the embryo. The neural crest is this strip of tissue, and the brain comes from the exact same place. So, you know, the brain and the neurons that are in the intestine both come from the embryonic neural crest. A blank slide there. So, the enteric nervous system is capable of autonomous functions, coordination of reflexes. Although it gets a lot of innervation from the autonomic, and it can and does operate independently of the brain and the spinal cord. There's a new study out now called neurogastroenterology, because now that they've figured out that the second brain is really involved in a lot of the things that are going on in our bodies, of course we have to have another specialty to deal with that. So now we have neurogastroenterologists. So the ENS function can be damaged by ischemia, which just means a lack of blood supply, transplantation, which, you know, they've actually transplanted parts of this from one person to another, and it still worked. So the anatomy of it, this just blows my mind. 100 million neurons, or about 1,000th of the number of neurons in the brain, more than the number of neurons in the spinal cord, and more than the number of neurons in the entire peripheral nervous system. That's pretty crazy, you know. So when they talk about second brain, it really is. There are more neurons or brain cells in your intestines than what's in your spinal cord. More than anywhere else except for the brain itself. So the neurons are collected into two types, the myenteric or Auerbach's and submucosal Meissner's plexuses. They're just located in different layers of the muscle wall of the intestine. Okay. And as we begin to understand more about this neural tissue, we find out it's full of neurotransmitters. which is crazy. You know, I mean, the neurotransmitters are the chemicals in our brain that make the brain function, that allow us to think and remember and do all the things that the brain does. It's all done through a complex interplay of various different neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and acetylcholine, all these neurotransmitters. Well, all of the neurotransmitters that we find in the brain are also found in the intestines. In fact, the really crazy thing about it is that 90% of the serotonin in our bodies is not in this brain, it's in this brain. Now, think about that for a minute. Serotonin. Everybody knows what serotonin is, right? That's what controls our mood, which makes us depressed or not depressed. Depressed if you don't have enough of it, not depressed if you have more of it. And what's depression considered to be? It's considered to be a mental illness, right? People who have chronic depression are put on antidepressant medications. So they're given Prozac or Effexor or something like that, which are called serum serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, which means they are drugs that allow the serotonin that you do have to work better. So where are those drugs working? We all thought they were working in the brain, right? Person's got depression, they've got a mental illness, well, we'll give them a drug that'll help them feel better and reverse their depression. It's got to be working in the brain. 90% of the serotonin in the body is in the intestines. So there's a huge connection between the central nervous system, the brain, and the enteric nervous system through the vagus nerve and the prevertebral ganglia nervous systems. But what they have found out is that you can slice the vagus nerve, you can cut it right in half, and this brain still continues to function. So there are enough neurons there that it is capable of independent operation. It's not just a slave to this brain. It's connected through a cable. We cut the cable, now it can't do anything. It can go ahead and function quite well on its own, even without this connection. So this is a really big, busy slide. And it's just talking about that in the enteric nervous system, the gut nervous system, there are efferent, afferent neurons, interneurons, all of which make the enteric nervous system more than what's in the entire spinal cord. The sensory neurons report on mechanical conditions, the intestinal muscles, controls peristalsis, etc. Other neurons control the secretion of enzymes, which is what allow us to digest. The enteric nervous system makes use of more than 30 neurotransmitters, most of which are identical to the ones in the CNS, such as acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, more than 9% of the body's serotonin, as well as 50% of the body's dopamine. Now, dopamine, of course, is the neurotransmitter that's involved in Parkinson's, right? So one of the things that's coming out of all of this kind of work that I find really exciting is that we're beginning to realize the interconnection between the digestive system and the brain, and what were considered to be either psychological illnesses or illnesses of the brain, like Parkinson's. There's some sort of connection to the intestines here, or we wouldn't see half of the dopamine in the body being located in that second brain in the intestinal tract. So this is exciting stuff. So as this professor here says, this system is way too complicated to involve only to make sure things move out of your colon. Scientists were shocked that 9% of the fibers in the primary visceral nerve, the vagus, carry information from the gut to the brain and not the other way around. So there's a huge connection there through the vagus nerve of the gut-brain, this enteric nervous system is collecting information and shipping that up to the brain so the brain can use that information to make decisions about how things should be operated. Some of the info is decidedly unpleasant. These guys always like to throw these little jokes in there, these little poop jokes. Second brain informs our state of mind in other more obscure ways. A big part of our emotions are influenced by the nerves in our gut. Butterflies in the stomach, signaling in the gut as part of our physiological stress response is but one example. Although gastrointestinal turmoil can sour one's moods, everyday emotional well-being may rely on messages from the brain below to the brain above. For example, electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve, a useful treatment for depression, may mimic these signals. So again, we're finding out more and more that things that are going on up here are tremendously influenced by what's happening down here. And certainly our emotional state plays a huge role in that. Now, one of the things it's not in here, but I'm just going to throw it in anyway. Way back when I was in university studying physiology, they talked about, it's well written up, they've published all kinds of journal articles about it and so forth. Way back in the 1950s, there was this poor guy who was in New York City. He was a homeless person, a street person, and he was in the wrong place, wrong time, and got caught up in a gun battle between the police and some gangsters. And he got shot. In fact, he got a shotgun blast to the abdomen. And the ambulances just sort of took everybody to the hospital, and they worked on them and sorted them out later. And they turned out, when they tried to figure out who this guy was, well, he wasn't one of the gangsters, he wasn't one of the police. So when he came out of surgery and regained consciousness, they sort of talked to him a bit and found out, hey, he was just some guy on the street, happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the weird thing was that when his wounds healed, they healed up in such a way that the surface of his stomach was actually visible from the outside. The skin and muscle had not healed completely over it, so there was this little piece of stomach tissue, like a little window into the stomach right there. And they thought, wow, that's really bizarre. And then, of course, the next thing they thought was, hey, we can use that, we can do research. So they said to this guy, because he was homeless, they said, we got a deal for you. We will allow you to live here in the hospital, 3 square meals a day, a warm roof over your head, a bed to sleep in, we'll give you some clothes, we'll maybe even give you some little jobs to do, push a broom around or whatever, if you'll let us study your stomach. And the guy said, sure, okay, I get to stay here, this is a cool deal. So he lived there for another 10 or 12 years, and they did research on him. Nothing invasive, all they were doing really was observing what was happening with his stomach. And they saw some really interesting things. And they saw a lot of how emotions made a huge difference in what was going on with his stomach. For example, if he were feeling sad or blue or melancholy, the stomach tissue got really sort of dark blue, almost black, and really, really hard, and it didn't really respond to anything. But on the other hand, if he got angry, if he was really, really upset about it, the little stomach tissue got bright, bright, bright red, and if you just stroked it with a glass rod, it would bleed. So they found out that emotions play a huge role in what happens to our intestines. And now that we know about this gut brain and the neurotransmitters that are down there, which obviously are very much involved in emotions, it makes perfect sense. So it's some pretty neat stuff going on with this latest research. So we know that it has the capacity to alter its responses compared to what's going on through it in the way of food, etc. But the other thing we found was that there's what are called support cells here, which are not neuronal cells. In other words, they're not brain cells. They don't carry on those kind of functions. They're similar to astroglia cells in the brain. Now, the astroglial cells are the sort of connective tissue supportive cells that hold the brain together. One of the things that people don't realize is that the brain cells, neuronal cells, are to a huge extent fat. People are, oh, everybody hates fat. People want to lose weight and diet and get rid of fat. But the reality is we absolutely need fat, and we especially need fat for our brains to function and our nervous systems to function, because fat is an insulator. And since neurological activity is primarily electrical in nature, we've got all these signals going through these wires. If the insulation isn't good, you can get crosstalk, you can get short circuits, you can get all kinds of things not working the way that they're supposed to. So your brain is actually about 70 to 80% fat, right? So next time you call somebody a fathead, you just compliment him. Say, man, you got a big brain. So we have to have these what are called glial cells, which are connective tissue cells, to kind of hold everything in place, to hold its shape. If you were to actually see, if we were to put a brain here on the table that was right fresh out of somebody's skull, and it hadn't been preserved with formaldehyde and all that stuff, it would, over a while, it would kind of melt into a puddle, Because brain tissue is about the consistency of toothpaste, right? Without the glial cells in there to hold it all together. So we're finding out now that this intestinal brain has the same thing. It has these supportive cells, which are similar to the glial cells, and it has a barrier around the capillaries surrounding these nerve tissues, which is very similar to the blood-brain barrier of the cerebral blood vessels. So it has an awful lot of the structural features of the brain in this second brain, right? It even has the blood-brain barrier to protect it from different things getting in. So given these two brains' commonalities, other depression treatments that target the mind can unintentionally impact the gut. So we find out that the nervous system, the enteric nervous system, uses more than 30 neurotransmitters, just the brain. Now this slide says 95%, the other one said 90%. They come from two different articles, but we can assume it's somewhere between 90 and 95%. Of the body, serotonin is found because antidepressant medications are called serotonin uptake inhibitors. They increase the serotonin levels. It's little wonder that these meds, which are meant to cause chemical changes in the brain, often provoke GI issues as a side effect. Irritable bowel syndrome also arises because of too much serotonin. So that's why quite often when people are given drugs to somehow affect their brain function, whether they're antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications or whatever, they quite often have gastrointestinal side effects, where the person has nausea, or they end up with diarrhea, or constipation, or something like that, because those drugs are going to be altering the neurological functions and effects that are going on in the intestines, because they're going to affect those brain cells the same way they affect the brain cells up here, right? So, let's talk for a little bit about what is the best way to ensure that we have a healthy, proper functioning gut-brain. And what it turns out is, some people here might have to develop a time machine, go back to when they were born and get their mother to breastfeed them, if they didn't get breastfed in the first place. More and more and more we're finding out, and of course there are all sorts of fantastic reasons why breastfeeding is absolutely the best thing for your baby. But let's just talk for a minute about the effect of breast milk, particularly on that brain. So we find that brain cell growth factors, like cytokines, were found in all breast milk samples at varying concentrations. So, and it has been demonstrated that protein extracts of breast milk increase the amount of surviving enteric neurons as well as neurite growth. Now these are neurite neurons, anything with NEU, and it refers to a nerve cell or a brain cell, okay? So that's what they're talking about. Additionally, it was shown the number of nested and S100 expressing glial cells increased significantly after incubating in breast milk protein extracts. Now again, we're talking about nested and glial cells. These are the cells that we talked about just a minute ago that are the support cells. They're not actually brain cells or neurological cells. These are the supportive structures that kind of hold everything in place and protect it. And so those were increased after breast milk protein extracts. So it suggests that milk-borne proteins support the development of the entire enteric nervous system. So, and we know that studies done, research that's been done years ago has shown quite conclusively that babies who were breastfed ended up smarter. They did better on intelligence testing. They were more likely to finish high school. They were more likely to go on and get a postgraduate education at college or university. There's been all kinds of research that has shown quite clearly that breastfed babies just end up smarter than bottle-fed babies. And here is the reason why. We're seeing specific things in breast milk that directly affect this neurological development of this gut brain. Okay? Part of the problem with children being fed anything other than breast milk, and believe me, I'm not here to bash anybody who didn't breastfeed their baby. There can be all kinds of reasons why women are not able to breastfeed or just can't for one reason or another. So I'm not about to pass judgment on anybody for that. We're just talking about the reality and the results of that. And we know that when children don't get breastfed, the human digestive system is designed for one thing and one thing only at birth, and that's human breast milk, either your mother's or some other willing female. And certainly not that many years ago, just a couple hundred years ago, there used to be a whole profession called wet nurse. And that was women who had really well-functioning mammary glands who were literally hired by people to breastfeed their babies because they couldn't do it before the development of formulas and all that stuff. But now that we've got all these formulas, what has happened is quite often children don't get breastfed, and they don't get anybody else's breast milk either. You know, when they don't get their mothers, they just get formula. And that formula means that there's a problem with the development of the nerve system and of the digestive system itself, and because of the really close interactions there with the immune system as well. So, researchers analyzed breast milk for brain growth factors, neurotrophic factors. Neurotrophic factors are proteins that are involved in the growth and survival of neurons, are essential during the early development of the brain and help to maintain healthy neuronal function throughout your life. Trophic just derives from the Greek word meaning to nourish. So neurotrophic factors are substances that nourish your neurons or nerve cells. And so what they found out was that there's nothing that you can do that's better than breastfeeding to ensure that that person has a much healthier brain and functioning nervous system the entire rest of their life. Now, if somebody didn't get breastfed as a child, and they're having problems with their immune system or their neurological systems, there are things that can be done. There are treatments that can be applied, be they digestive enzyme therapy or nutritional therapies or acupuncture, or there's lots of different things that you can do to help improve the function, but it will never be as good as it would have been if that person had been breastfed. So there is some hope, but ideally the best thing would be to just have everybody breastfed. A number of years ago, the World Health Organization was asked by some of the various different groups that are always trying to figure out what should we be doing to help the health of the world, and they said, what's the one thing that you would suggest, one thing that we could do that would have the biggest impact on increasing the level of health of the entire planet? What's the one thing that you can pick? And of course they suspected they would say something like, oh, we've got to increase our vaccination programs or neonatal care or this, that, or whatever. The World Health Organization said every single child on the planet breastfed for at least a year. That was the one thing that was going to make the biggest impact. And we can see from this that this is why. That's the thing that helps those nerve cells, whether they're here or here, to develop properly. So not only were there growth factors and cytokines found in all breast milk samples, but researchers demonstrated that protein extracts in breast milk increase the amount of surviving neurons as well as neuroid outgrowth, which indicates that lipid plays a beneficial role in the enteric nervous system's development. So your brain and the gut develop the same type of tissue as we said before. During field development, one part turns into the central nervous system and the other part develops into your enteric nervous system. The two systems are then connected by the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, runs from your brainstem down into your abdomen. And this is what connects the two brains together. We talked about that before. These, quite literally your second brain, they work in tandem, each influencing the other. This is why your intestinal health can have such a profound influence on your mental health and vice versa. So that's the other thing that I find really exciting about this research, because it really solidifies and verifies what I've known for a long, long time, and we've done lots of work with kids about this. The massive explosion that we've seen in ADD, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, all these, behavioral disorders of children that were never around, 50 years ago or 60 years ago or whatever, that are just exploding. And how many children do we see now that are put on Ritalin or other psychotropic drugs because they have one of these, quote, disorders? And nobody has made the connection that what they eat has a huge amount to do with that. And whether or not they got breastfed as a child has a huge amount to do with that. And certainly, I've had huge arguments with neurologists and pediatricians about children that have got ADD or ADHD, talking about, well, let's have a look at their diet and maybe do some testing to see if they've got food allergies or something, and they just poo-poo it and say, oh, it's nothing to do with it. But you ask them, okay, then what causes it? What causes ADD or ADHD? They can't tell you. They have no answer. So, well, it's a brain neurotransmitter disorder. Yeah, okay, fine, that's what it is. What causes it? They can't say. Right? They don't know. Oh, we need more research in that area. No, we don't. We've got it right here. Okay? So, I love this slide. This is a really great slide. And you have to really look at this carefully. Because what this is talking about is, as it says, digestion, gut permeability, food allergy, and bowel toxicity. So this is what's happening in the intestines. And what we're looking at is these little Y-shaped guys here are antibodies, right? And here, this is the absorptive surface of the intestinal wall, right? That's our intestinal membrane. Now, we've been talking about the gut brain, and we've said the gut brain was located in several different layers of the sort of muscle wall of the intestine. But what we're talking about here, this is like this is your second skin, right? Our inner skin. This is the liner of the intestine. Now, understand, the skin, our outer skin and our inner skin have very much the same function in the sense that they're designed as a barrier to prevent stuff from getting in, right? And one of the ways that things can get into our bodies is because we ate them, or we ingested them, we swallowed them. They now have several hours where they're in close proximity to this liner here, where they have an opportunity to get across that lining, get across that barrier, and get into the bloodstream, right? Our external skin here, you know, people don't realize if you ever were to take a micrographic picture of your hand, you've got bacteria all over you all the time. I don't care how often you take a shower or how well you clean yourself, you've got bacteria living on you all the time. That's okay, as long as they stay on the outside. And that's why I could take a perfectly sterile scalpel and cut you. And if we don't do something to prevent it, you're going to get infected from that cut. Why? There was nothing on the scalpel. There's no bacteria there. It's on your skin. And the minute we cut that skin and create an opening, now it has a chance to get in, right? And get into the bloodstream. Same thing happens inside us, because we have this inner skin. We have this liner of our intestinal tube that acts like an inner skin, again, to protect us from stuff getting through, from bacteria, viruses, other things, from being able to get into the bloodstream, right? Now, the other thing that we have that interacts with this inner liner, this lining of the intestinal tract, is food, right? When we digest food properly, when we digest food completely, we end up with these little tiny particles, and they can all get in here, and that's okay. Improperly digested food particles aren't supposed to be able to get through. But if they do, like you see, we hear one here where we've got these three things together. This thing is getting through the skin and into the bloodstream. Well, now the antibodies are going to react to it, right? Because that's what they're designed to do. Antibodies are designed to recognize and respond to foreign molecules in the blood, right? That's the big part of their job. That's how they recognize bacteria and viruses and parasites, yeast. That's how they recognize cancerous cells, because cancerous cells have altered DNA, right? That's what makes them a cancer cell, not a normal cell, because their DNA is now different. It's mutated. And every single one of our cells that has normal DNA, the immune system, these little antibody guys, can recognize it and say, oh, that's okay, they're cool, they're good, they got the right DNA. Okay? Anything that doesn't is considered to be a foreign invader and therefore must be attacked. And so if we have these food particles that are not completely digested, that weren't supposed to be able to get through, but they did, they're going to trigger these antibodies. And these antibodies are going to follow them right into the bloodstream. And now we have what we're calling circulating immune complexes. And so these things are going to trigger an immune system reaction. And so the antibodies are going to signal white blood cells to get into the game here. And the white blood cells are going to come over and say, oh, here's a problem, we got an antibody, we got some partially digested something here, we better get to work. And the antibodies and the white blood cells are going to release inflammatory chemicals. They're going to release leukotrienes and kinins and other chemicals that are responsible for inflammation. Now, so if this is all going on in the bloodstream, well, what does the blood do? The blood feeds everything, right? And so our inner brain, our enteric brain, has a blood supply, right? Those nerve cells have to be fed blood because they require oxygen, they require require sugar, they require nutrients in order to be able to stay alive and function. They've got to be getting blood supply. And if the blood supply has got these in it, then there's going to be inflammation and irritation affecting those neurological cells, right? And if they get affected like that, what happens? Everybody knows what happens if you get a rash on your external skin here, right? It gets red, it gets itchy, it gets inflamed, maybe little pustules form or something like that. What happens if you get a rash on your brain or on this brain? What happens then? That has to have an effect on neurotransmitter synthesis, neurotransmitter function, and therefore neurological function, neuron function. Well, we've got 100 million of them in here, right? They've got to be involved in what's going on in our entire process. Think about this for a moment. You can feel the air moving in and out of your lungs. You can feel yourself breathing when you breathe, right? You can feel your heart pounding in your chest. You can feel digestion sometimes if you've eaten something you shouldn't have and it's protesting. You can feel all that stuff going on because there's sensors in there that tell us. How do you know where you're thinking when you're thinking? When you're thinking, can you feel something happening in here? Or can you feel it in here? Or can you feel it anywhere? Probably not. I can. So we don't know how much thought process takes place in this enteric compared to what's taking place up here. But certainly we know that this kind of thing going on is going to have an effect, one way or the other, on those thought processes. So to me, this is not a far stretch at all to come to the realization that if somebody's eating something that they shouldn't be, that is provoking an allergic or an immune system response that involves inflammatory chemicals, it could sure as heck be involved in something like ADD, ADHD, or so-called learning disabilities, or oppositional defiant disorder, depression, all sorts of so-called psychological conditions could be purely physical in nature because of this connection. So to me, this is an exciting and interesting situation going on with this latest research that confirms that what happens in this gut brain has a huge effect on what's going on with the person's entire picture of behavior and thought process. Okay. So what do we want to have going on in here, obviously? We want friendly, good guys, friendly bacteria. This is, of course, probiotics, Acidophilus, bifidus, and all the good bacteria are what we want living in here. Because that's going to give us synthesis of B vitamins, pathogen inhibition, better digestion, natural antibiotics, normalization of the whole body's pH or acid-base balance. And we've talked about that before on other occasions when I've been here. We've talked about the importance of maintaining proper acid-alkaline balance in the body. Dysbiosis is that situation that it occurs where we've got like we talked about, leaky gut syndrome, where these improperly digested or incompletely digested things can get through and still get into the bloodstream and then have an effect on our neurological tissues. So we can have the basal fungal forms, mycelia, with all sorts of problems where we've got the bad guys, bad bacteria, yeast and stuff like that that are invading and penetrating, making holes in the intestinal wall. So we want to obviously do away with that and reestablish healthy intestinal microflora, okay, so that we get the good bacteria back in here and make us all happy again, like these little smiley guys. Okay, so one of the things that I think needs to be made better aware of so people understand what's going on is that, I think an awful lot of people would benefit from having their digestive function assessed, either through something like 24-hour urine analysis, or even just something as simple as finding out if you got food allergies or not. Because lots of times, allergies don't present in an obvious way. I think most people have this idea in their heads that all allergies are like a peanut allergy. If you ate something that you're allergic to, you'd instantly break out in a rash or hives, or your throat would start to close, your eyes would be watering, you'd have this massive response, this massive reaction that would tell you, without a doubt, oh my God, I must be allergic to that. But that doesn't happen all the time. It only happens in a very, very small percentage of cases. lots of times people will eat things that they're allergic to, and the reaction is so subtle, and it might take anywhere from 15 minutes to 72 hours before you actually get that reaction. So it's pretty hard to track it back to, if you even notice the reaction, it's pretty hard to track it back to what you eat. And as I say, lots of times the reactions are not something as blatant and obvious as a rash or whatever. The reaction might be something simple like mucus congestion in your sinuses, and you just think you've got a cold or something like that, you know. Or it might just be that you're feeling a little foggy and you just can't really think clearly, which of course might have something to do with neurological function in one place or the other, right? You know, or even just mood swings. You know, people are just depressed, or they fluctuate between they're happy one second and crying the next. You know, and all those sorts of things. It's interesting that a number of years ago, those were all considered to be likely candidates for allergic reactions, right? The crazy part is, prior to 1926, all those sorts of things, behavioral problems, you know, insomnia, you know, emotional states, all these sorts of things were written up in medical journals. They were written up in medical textbooks as being likely allergic reactions to food, right? Then in 1926, there was this huge meeting in New York City where all of the North American and European allergists, read male MDs, all got together and decided quite arbitrarily that the only thing that was an allergic reaction was an IgE reaction, which is a specific type of immunoglobulin that gives you the classic response, you know, redness, inflamed, a hive, or itchiness, you know, runny eyes, which could ultimately progress to anaphylaxis and threaten the person's life because their throat closes, right? That's the only thing that's an allergic reaction. Everything else is just a sensitivity or an intolerance, right? Now, just them deciding that and, you know, proceeding on that basis doesn't make it true. So quite often there are many other allergic responses in the sense that they're going to trigger exactly what we saw on that slide a couple of slides ago, in the sense that they're going to cause this to be happening. But it might be a different type of immunoglobulin. It might not be IgE. It could be IgG, IgA, IgM, IgD. There are lots of immunoglobulins that could be involved in this that aren't going to give you that classic, you know, flame irritation type reaction. But they could still cause lots of behavioral and emotional type responses. And that's why I think that, you know, delving more and more into this whole idea of looking at the relationship between food and digestion and what's happening with our enteric brain is somewhere where we need to go a little further to really have a good idea about how do we deal with these people to help them out. So, complex and hidden brain and gut marks bellyaches and butterflies. Ever wonder why people get butterflies, or why an impending job interview can cause an attack of intestinal cramps? Why antidepressants targeted for the brain cause nausea or abdominal upset in millions of people who take such drugs? Well, we kind of already talked about that. So the reason for that is that the two brains, the familiar one encased in the brain up here, and the other one in the intestine. So, yeah, this is a lot of the same thing. Yeah, I put this one up because it was this guy here, this Michael Gershon, professor of anatomy, has looked a lot more into the brain here, playing a role in human happiness, misery, depression, that sort of stuff. He looked a little bit more closely at the relationship between what's going on here and people's you know, emotional states or their, you know, their mental states. Okay, and for sure, I mean, and I've had patients who've come in to see me, you know, who had problems going on, you know, chronic abdominal pain and stuff, who were told that the problems were imaginary, emotional, all in their heads. You know, maybe you should see a psychiatrist, you know, that sort of stuff. And when we looked into it, you know, fairly simply, just by doing some simple tests like live cell blood analysis and 24-hour urine analysis and things like that, we quickly figured out that they had that whole dysbiosis, you know, leaky gut thing going on, and that was contributing to all of their symptoms. I had a woman come in to see me one time. She was about 42. She was the CEO of a big company, She came in just impeccably, manicured and coiffed and everything else. And she just said, "If you can't help me, I'm probably going to jump off a bridge." I'm like, "Okay, no pressure there." And I said, "Well, what is wrong?" And she says, "I don't know. They tell me I must be crazy, but I'm sure I'm not." I said, "Well, what are the symptoms? What's happening?" And she said, "Well, I'm the CEO of this big company, And she said, "I come in the morning, and my secretary puts a stack of paper on my desk like this, and I've got until 10 o'clock to get it all read and understand what's in there, because then we're going to have our quarterly sales meeting, and I have to know what's in there to understand it well enough to be able to discuss it at the meeting, and we can talk about what our strategy is going to be for the upcoming quarter to improve sales or whatever, right?" She says, "I'm sitting there, and for half an hour I'm staring at the first page. And I can start at the top, read my way to the bottom. By the time I get to the bottom of the page, I can't remember what's at the top of the page. And I don't understand it anyway, even if I can remember what it says." And she said, "That's not me. I know this stuff. I do this all the time." And she says, "It's just in the last couple of years it has got gradually worse and worse and worse and worse." And she says, "My brain just doesn't work anymore." And I says, "Well, okay, what other kind of symptoms are you having?" So she was having a lot of fatigue, insomnia. She would fall asleep, wake up at 3 a.m. and not be able to get back to sleep. There was a number of different things going on. And she had been all over the place. She'd been down to Toronto. She'd been to Living Health Sciences there. She'd been to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. And they all checked her out and said, "Well, physically there's nothing wrong with you. Maybe you should talk to a psychiatrist." So she said, "No, I'm not crazy." And I said, "Well, let's have a look." So we went there. She was so loaded with yeast, it was unbelievable. Completely. Blood was just packed with it. And I just said, "Well, there's a problem right there." And she said, "Well, could that cause all the..." I said, "Oh yeah, just that one thing could be responsible for all the symptoms that you're experiencing." And she said, "How come none of the other doctors did this blood test?" I said, "No, because they don't believe this is even possible." So, we put her on a program, 3 or 4 months. She was fine. All her symptoms were gone. She could read this stuff at work and understand it again. Figured it all out. But that's a perfect example of how what's going on in here can totally affect what's happening up here. So it says doctors were right in describing these problems to the brain, but they blame the wrong one. Many gastrointestinal disorders like colitis, irritable bowel originate from problems in the gut's brain. Current wisdom that most ulcers are caused by a bacteria, not by hidden anger at one's mother. So these guys got a weird sense of humor. Nearly every substance that helps really control the brain is turned up in the gut. All the neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, glutamine, norepinephrine, nitric oxide are all there. 24 small brain proteins called neuropeptides are also in the gut, as are some major cells of the immune system. Enkephalins, one class of the body's natural opiates, are in the gut. And in the finding that stumps researchers, the gut is a rich source of benzodiazepines, the family of psychoactive chemicals that includes such ever popular drugs as Valium and Xanax. So here's another crazy finding, is that there are neuropeptides, neurotransmitters, other brain chemicals that are made in the gut that then end up in the brain and affect what's happening up here. Right? And as I said, major cells of the immune system. So that was the other thing we talked about under the importance of children being breastfed and everything else, is because the digestive system, the neurological system, and the immune system are all like that. They're totally intertwined, and whatever affects one affects the other. So like we said, quite often we will see people who never got breastfed as a child. They might have had a lot of colic as a baby and a lot of gastrointestinal problems as a young child. They come to see us as a young adult or an adult, and they've got all sorts of immune system problems. And that's because the immune system cannot develop properly either if the right things aren't happening in the intestines. Because the immune system is totally tied into this as well. Now, one thing that isn't on this slide presentation, because it's sort of part of a different presentation, is that we already found out there's 100 million neurons in the intestine, more than anywhere else in the brain except for the brain, more than anywhere else in the body except for the brain, more than what's in the spinal cord. But the other thing that's about the intestines that's interesting is that there is more immunological tissue wrapped around the intestines than everywhere else in the entire body. And again, because, like we said, that inner lining, that inner skin, is our main defense against penetration by external forces like microorganisms and stuff. So obviously, where do we want to concentrate our defenses is around a place where we're most likely to be penetrated, right? Where something can get in. And that's the intestinal tract, because again, you know, we have a lot around our lungs too, but you know, you can breathe in bacteria and viruses and stuff like that, but stuff stays in your lungs for only a few seconds. It goes in and goes back out again when you breathe out the next breath. When something goes into your intestinal tract, it stays in there for several hours, or a few days maybe, if you've got a slow moving intestinal tract. So it's got a lot more opportunity to get out of there and get into your bloodstream. That's why we have so much immunological tissue wrapped around our intestines to protect us, because that's where the risk is the greatest. But this was really interesting, finding that, you know, benzodiazepines are in the intestinal brain. And of course, these are, you know, like anti-anxiety and you know, antidepressant type drugs, basically. So you know, we find out that the body makes most of what it needs. We just have to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do the right way. So the brain sends signals to the gut by talking to a small number of command neurons, which in turn send signals to the gut interneurons that carry messages up and down. Both command neurons and internneurons are spread throughout two layers of gut tissue called the myenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus. Solar plexus is actually a boxing term that just refers to these nerves right here that if you strike them hard, it makes it really hard for a person to breathe. So they control more the diaphragm, actually. The command neurons control the pattern of activity in the gut. The vagus nerve only alters the volume by changing its rate of firing. So the vagus nerve really just triggers these other interneurons to work. These plexuses also contain glial cells that nourish the neurons and mast cells that are involved in the immune response and the blood-brain barrier that keeps harmful substances away from the important neurons. We have sensors for sugar, protein, acidity, and other chemical factors that might monitor the progress of digestion, determining how the gut mixes and propels its contents. It's not a simple pathway. It uses complex integrated circuits not unlike those found in the brain. Now this didn't surprise me when I saw this, because I have always maintained, and any of you here that have heard me speak on this topic before know that I'm a huge believer in that the proper digestion, absorption, and metabolism of nutrients is probably the single most important thing that goes on in the body when you're talking about dealing with health. And how do we stay healthy or get healthy if we become unhealthy? Okay. So, you know, because that's the bottom line behind so many problems is a lack of proper nutrition. Okay. Because we are such complex beings and we require so much of so many different things because we simply cannot make them ourselves. We absolutely depend on getting them from our environment. And that includes things like oxygen and water and obviously food and all the elements of food, proteins, you know, vitamins, minerals, you know, trace elements, essential fatty acids, you know, oils, etc., etc. But whether or not you eat those things is not nearly as important as do you process them properly once you actually put them into your system. So the fact that we've got a very complex brain, separate brain that's involved in controlling all of that doesn't surprise me at all. Because it's a very, very, very important process. So it needs its own brain to look after it. So the gut brain and the head brain act the same way when they're deprived of input. I found this really interesting too from the outside world. During sleep, the head brain produces 90-minute cycles of slow wave sleep punctuated by periods of rapid eye movement sleep in which dreams occur. During the night, when there's no food to be worked on, the gut brain produces 90-minute cycles of slow wave muscle contraction punctuated by short bursts of rapid muscle movement. So the functional activity of these two brains is very, very, very similar. You can't say they're identical, but they're very similar. So, not surprising given that they develop from the same part of the embryological tissue. So it really is another brain that lives down in your intestines. So here's the big question: can the gut brain learn? Does it think for itself? Dr. Grusha tells a story about an old army sergeant, a male nurse in charge of a group of paraplegics. With their lower spinal cords destroyed, the patients would get impacted. The sergeant was anal compulsive, says Dr. Grusha. At 10 a.m. every day, patients got enemas. Then the sergeant got rotated off the ward. His replacement decided to give the enemas only after compaction occurred. But at 10 the next morning, everyone on the ward had a bowel movement. the same time without an enema? Had the sergeant trained those colons? Interesting question, right? But I think we can all agree that, you know, if we've got a brain here, and this brain here can learn how to do things and be trained, why wouldn't this one be able to be trained? And, you know, aside from this one, think about, you know, the old thing, Pavlov's dog, you know, and that's a very famous experiment. A lot of people don't think really understand exactly what happened there, but, you know, the Russian scientist Pavlov had a bunch of dogs that he was doing neurological training stuff with, and he found that every time he fed them, he rang a bell. They would salivate. Of course, their saliva glands in their mouth would start to produce saliva because they needed it to digest the food, right? But then he found that after a while, he could just ring the bell, and the dogs would begin to salivate, even though he didn't have any food there for them. You know, so the brain had learned to respond to that sound by saying, "Oh, bell, dinner time, better make saliva," right? So it begs the question, since the saliva glands are actually part of the digestive system, which brain was being trained in Pavlov's experiment? Was it this one, or was it this one? This is the brain that controls every aspect of digestion, including salivation in the mouth, right? So we already know the answer to this. You know, aside from this situation with the sergeant, Pavlov showed way back in the 1800s that you can train this brain. Absolutely. So, the gut has for a long time been seen as a repository of good and bad feelings. Emotional states from the head brain are mirrored in the gut brain, where they're felt by those who pay attention to them. So, you know, the thing that we said at the beginning, you know, maybe, you know, so-called gut instinct, or you know, go with your gut as a means of making a decision, is because, again, we're using a different brain to do that kind of decision-making thing. But, of course, you know, going with instinct or going with your gut is also associated with the whole concept of, you know, making a sort of a head decision as opposed to a gut decision usually means carefully analyzing all of the pros and cons and, you know, looking at it very intellectually and then deciding what the right course of action is. Where going by your gut instinct is kind of like, well, you don't do any of that. You just say, well, how do I feel about it? I think I should do this. Okay, that's my gut instinct, right? So we're talking about using a totally different kind of process in terms of making a decision by going with your gut or going with instinct, where you're not necessarily sort of lining up facts and, you know, extrapolating what would happen if we did this or that or the other thing. You're just making a very simple thing to say, well, what do I think, what do I feel is the right answer here, the right decision to make, and going with that. And of course, as I think most people in the room know, quite often those decisions that you make just sort of off the cuff by saying, oh, my gut tells me I should do this, always work out to be the right ones, the right decision. Okay, that I think is it for the slideshow part of the presentation. At this point in time, we'll just throw it open to the floor for questions. If anybody has any questions they want to ask about what we